All right, welcome. So this is Unit 10, Day 1. We are starting a brand new unit, which is all about introduction to percents. So here's your learning target. I can estimate percent by using different methods. Now to begin, if you would rather take notes on an actual physical paper copy and printing off papers is kind of a pain, we have all of your homework assignments and notes for this entire unit already printed off. They're just in the front office of the school. So if you would like to do that, you are more than welcome to. What we are asking is that your homework, even if you fill it out on the physical copy, like your paper copy, we're asking that you would still submit it on Canvas so that way we can still keep your grade updated and know what you've done, unless you can find another way to let us know what you've done. Okay, so here we go. I have this little paragraph thing. It's key vocabulary words. I'm not going to go over all of them because we are still going to talk about them in future lessons, but I will give a quick refresher on some words that you should be familiar with by now. The first one is percent. You should be a little bit familiar with this one. It's a quantity out of 100. So for example, if you had 75 out of 100, that's the same thing as 75%. Percent error we'll talk about later. Proportions, we've spent an entire unit on this one. They are two equal ratios. So for example, 1/2 is the same thing as 30 over 60. And you know that they're the same because you could take your numerator, divide it by the denominator. So I would do 1 divided by 2, that would give me 0.5. And 30 divided by 60 would also give me 0.5. So yes, those are equal to each other. They are proportional. The next one is rate. We've talked about this word before. It's a comparison between two quantities with different units of measure. So you could say how many minutes per mile or miles per minute are people going, and you could say these numbers right here, minutes and miles. Here's the thing. We are comparing two quantities with different units of measure. I have minutes and I have miles. So that is rate. The next one is a ratio, which is a comparison between two different quantities. So that's just a fraction. You could say 1/2. That's a ratio, and yes, that's true. The next one, simple interest. We'll talk about that later. And then unit rate is a comparison of two measurements with a denominator of 1. So that means, well, how much does one thing cost, or anything that has 1 as the denominator. So I know each cookie that I buy is going to be $2, so the price per cookie for one cookie would be $2. That's just another quick example. It's anything that has a denominator of 1. And the reason I really wanted to go over unit rate is because a lot of people forget what unit rate means. It's just when your fraction has the denominator of 1. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the lesson. I think you're going to like this lesson today because it's a review of proportions, which we've spent quite some time on. So, proportion. A proportion is a term used when there are two equal ratios. And proportions can be used to solve for missing pieces of information. It's like problem solving. So if you like that, you're really going to like this lesson. There are two different ways to solve proportions. The first one is scaling and the second one is cross multiplication. And we're going to talk about those in these next few problems. Okay, question number 1. The scale on a map is 2 centimeters is equal to 15 miles. 2 centimeters is equal to 15 miles. Well, Dave measures the distance to the next town at 7 centimeters. How many miles away is the next town? Here's what I really, really, really want you to know. I'm going to use a different color now. What I really want you to observe is that I put centimeters being equal to centimeters, and I put miles being equal to miles. That's how you have to set up your proportions. That's your quick review. Okay, so as a class, we have talked about so many different ways to solve proportions. So many different ways. So I'll give you the shortcut that we've talked about with cross multiplication, but I'm also going to show you another way that our classes have talked about. The first one is you could say, what did I do to go from 2 centimeters to 7 centimeters? So what we could do is 7 divided by 2, and that would say, well, I just got 3.5. So what I know here is that I'm multiplying my numbers by 3.5. If I multiply the top number by 3.5, so 2 times 3.5 gives me 7, then I would do the same exact thing to the bottom. I would say 15 miles times 3.5, and that will give me my answer over here. Because what you do to the top, you have to do that to the bottom. Let's go ahead and try that out and see what we get. 15 times 3.5, and that gives me 52.5. And my answer is going to be miles because I'm talking about miles on the bottom of our fractions. Now, another way that my students specifically, really like to solve this, we've talked about so many different ways to solve proportions, and what they figured out is that there is kind of a shortcut that you can use. So let's talk about that really quickly. You could do 7 times 15 divided by 2 will give you your answer. And this works every single time, no matter what. So the trick is to start above your variable that you don't know. So I don't know what my question mark is or my x is, so I'm going to start above it. I would say 7 times 15 divided by 2, and that will give me my answer. If I plug that into my calculator, I would also get 52.5. So it's up to you what way you want, and there's still even more ways. Those are just a couple. Well, since we've spent so much time on proportions, that should have been a really long review for you. All right, question number 2. An NFL team kicker misses 2 out of 11 field goals. I'm just going to say FG. 2 is what he misses out of 11 field goals. If he misses 8 field goals, or if he missed 8 field goals throughout the season, how many did he attempt? Well, we don't know how many field goals he attempted, but what you'll see here is that I have how many he missed set equal to how many he missed. And I have the total number of field goals set equal to the total number of field goals. It's really important that you keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to use a different color here. What you could say is, how does he go from 2 misses to 8 misses? What are we multiplying by? Well, we're multiplying by 4. So what you do to the top, you have to do that to the bottom in order to keep everything proportional. So 11 times 4, that gives us 44. Another way that you could solve this, let's switch colors again, is you could do 8 times 11 divided by 2, and that will give you your answer of 44. And my answer would be 44 field goals. I just don't want to write it out, so I'm just going to say FG. All right, next question. Percent estimation. A percent is a part to whole ratio where the whole is always 100%. Complete the charts below with the missing information. So let's take a look at how many squares there are here. Instead of counting up every single square that's here, I'm just going to say how many squares are there across the top and how many squares are there across the side. Well, I know that there's 10 across the top and there's 10 across the side. And now I can just multiply them together to get my answer, which gives me 100. So I know that there are 100 squares all together. Well, my question is, how many of the squares are shaded? And I could count all of these up, and it would be 25 of the squares are shaded. So that is my percent over the whole. Well, to get a decimal, what you could do is you could say 25, so just take the top number and divide it by the bottom number, and that will give us the decimal of shaded squares to the total squares. 25 divided by 100 gives me 0.25. So that's going to be my decimal. Now, if I wanted to change that into a percentage, I could do 0.25, and I could just move my decimal 2 places over and put a percent sign instead. And that gives me 25%. Let's go ahead and try that for the next question. It says here we have 85%. Well, if I had my shaded boxes out of the total number of boxes, that means I would have 85 boxes out of 100 that are shaded. And if I had to make that into a decimal, I could do 85 divided by 100, and that would give me 0.85. Or another way I could get 0.85 is if I take my percent sign and I move it 2 places to the left, that moves it back to a decimal, which also gives me 0.85. Okay, let's move on to the third question. It starts by giving us a percent over the whole. So it says 40 boxes are shaded out of 100. What's the percent of boxes that are shaded? Well, there are, let's talk about a decimal first. 40 divided by 100, that gives us 0.40. Once again, I got that by doing 40 divided by 100. Now, if I wanted to move that into a percent, I just take my decimal, move it 2 places to the right, and then put a percent sign. So I would have 40% compared to my decimal, which is just 0.40. Okay, so let's move on to the next section, which says a percent can also be written using a percent. What is that word that we're going to use? A percent bar or a percent proportion. And let's switch up the colors here. A percent bar or percent proportion. So you'll notice down below here, we have a percent bar. 1/5 is equal to what out of 100? Well, we've already done proportions before, and what we know is you could solve it. Let's go ahead and switch colors. You could do 100 times 1 divided by 5 will give you your answer. Let's see what I get actually. 100 times 1 divided by 5, that just gave me 20. So your answer would be 20 out of 100. Or another way that you could solve this is you could say, what did I do to go from 5 to 100? Well, we could figure this out. If we did 100 divided by 5, that gives me 20. So I know to go from 5 to 100, I times the bottom by 20. Whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top to keep things proportional. So I know 1 times 20 is 20. That's kind of cool. If I were to fill out this percent bar and percent proportion, blah, 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 if I were to fill this out, this is what it would look like, okay? So I have one box out of 5, and we want to see what the proportion or what the percent, we want to see what the percent is for that. I'm going to erase all this stuff down below so we can actually work here. Well, 5 would be 100 because that's the max number of things we have. Let's pretend I have 5 Snickers candy bars. Well, that means I still have 100% of my candy bars. But if I give away 1 out of my 5, how many of my candy bars did I just give away? I would have just given away 20% of my candy bars. And let's just go ahead and fill that back in. 1/5 we said was equal to 20 out of 100. There's a lot of different ways that you can get this answer right here of 20. And you will get 20 every time. There's just so many different ways. So if you have a way that you would like me to share with the class and with all the students in 7th grade, let me know because I would love to share it. And yes, there are so many different options and ways that you could fill this out. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the second question. 3/4 is equal to what out of 100? If I were to draw out my fraction bar, let's just say this is 4 and this is 3 out of the 4. Okay, 3 out of the 4, what does that equal in terms of percent? So what we could do is just once again solve our proportion. What did we do to go from 4 to 100? What are we multiplying by? I'm going to use a different color here. If I multiply by, well, how can we figure that out? We could do 100 divided by 4, and that would give us 25. So I know that if I did 4 times 25 gives me 100, I have to do the same thing to the top. 3 times 25 gives me 75. So my answer is 75. So this one would be 75%. Because 75 over 100 is the same thing as 0.75. And you could also convert that to a percentage by moving the decimal 2 places to the right, which gives you 75%. Now, another way that you could have solved this is my students. I've taken polls. I've said, which one do you like the best? And this is the one that they say hands down all the time. They like doing this. 100 times 3 divided by 4, and that will give you 75. So you always want to end at what you don't know. We didn't know what 75 was. Let's pretend that there was an X there or a question mark. You start directly below it. You'd say 100 times 3 divided by 4, and that gives you your X value, which is 75 or 75%. So that's pretty cool. All right, let's see what else we have here. Percent bars can be used to blank the percentage. Well, they can be used to estimate the percentage. That's pretty cool. Let's go ahead and fill in here, estimate. So set up a percent bar and then describe what you notice. They're saying, what is 50% of 50? Well, I want to give you kind of a little trick here or a tip. Let's pretend I have 50 cans or 50 bottles of water. I have 50 bottles of water. What is 50% of 50 bottles of water? If 50 bottles was 100, what is just 50% of that? What's half? Well, 25 bottles of water. Now, here's one thing that you could do. You could say, what's 50% of 50? Well, 50% in a decimal form is the same thing as 0.5. I know this because I could take 50% and just move my decimal 2 places to the left. So what I could say is 50% is the same thing as 0.5 or 0.50. Of could be multiply, and then 50, let's just leave that there. Here's what you could type into your calculator. 0.5 times 50, and that will tell us what 50% of 50 is. Let's try it. 0.5 times 50 gives me 25. So that just gave us our answer. Kind of cool. Let's go ahead and do question 4. Set up a percent bar and then describe what you notice. What is 25% of 50? So I'm going to switch colors here again. Let's see, if I had 50 bottles of water. My color's being tricky. Okay, if I had 50 bottles of water, what is 25% of 50? Well, this would be 100% of 50. And half of 100 is 50. And half of 50 is 25%. And then that means in between 50% and 75%, in between 50% and 100% is 75%. Okay, so what do we notice here? What's 25% of 50? What you could do, 25% of 50 is the same thing as, let's move our percent sign 2 places over and get a decimal. 0.25 of, multiply, of 50. You just type that in your calculator. 0.25 times 50, let's see what we get. I just got 12.5, and so that's your answer right there. I hope you can read that, 12.5. So that's how we know what this one's going to be. Let's see, 50% of 50 would be 25. So if you wanted to estimate, here's what you could do. You could say, oh, what's half of 50? 25. And what's half of 25? 12.5. That's how you could estimate. All right, let's move on to the next question, which says, what's 10% of 50? And now I'm just going to show you what we could do here. 10% of 50. You would just do the decimal form, which is 0.10. Of means to multiply in this case, and then 50 right there. So let's just type this in. 0.10 times 50, and that gives me 5. So 5 is your answer. And you could fill out this whole bar thing, but it doesn't work. I mean, this bar thing does work, but I don't see you doing this on your homework all the time for every question. So I wanted to give you kind of a general thing that you could do every time that would work. Here's what our picture is going to show. If we had 50, that's the same thing as 100%. And if we wanted to know what 10% of 50 is, your answer would be 5. So here's what your bar, your percent bar would look like. Here's what I notice. I notice that 10% is 1/10 of 100. And I also notice that you can move the decimal in both numbers to find 10%. That's kind of cool. Okay, and then the very last question, use percent bars to estimate the solutions below. What is 20% of 80? Well, here's what you could do. 20% of 80, we would just do 0.20 or 0.2, sorry. Of is to multiply in this case, and then 80. Let's see what we get. 0.2 or 0.20 times 80, and that gives me 16. So boom, there you have your answer. And if you wanted to write this out, you totally could. Let's say this were 80, that means we would have 100% down below. It looks like these are going to be in 10 and 20% or 10% increments. So we'd have 10% and 20% down below. Well, we know that 20% of 80 is 16, And then 10% is half of 20. So what's half of 16? 8. So that's how you would fill that one out. But your answer here, 20% of 80 is 16. And what is 75% of 200? Well, you would say 75% of 200. 75% is the same thing as 0.75. Of, in this case, means to multiply, and then 200, and we get our answer. 0.75 times 200 gives me 150. So there's your answer. If you wanted to write this out using the percent bar, you would say 200 is your total, which is equal to 100%. Half of 200 is 100. Whoops, I didn't mean to draw the percent sign right there. So that means that 100 out of 200 is the same thing as 50%. And in between 50% and 75% is 75%. And what's 75% of 200? Well, we would say what is exactly halfway between 100 and 200? It's 150. So 150 would be your answer. Kind of cool. Anyways, let us know if you have any questions. Thanks so much for watching, and good luck on your homework.